Before we get stuck into it, I would love to do an acknowledgement of country. Adelaide's Sustainable Building Network acknowledges the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, Tartania, where our work is most often undertaken. We also acknowledge the Paramank people of the Mount Lofty Ranges, the Ngarrindjeri of Fleurieu, Coorong and Lower Murray regions, and the Ngurri of the Barossa and Mid-North as the traditional custodians of the land where we live and work. We pay our respects to elders past and present of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders nations.
Thanks, Ben. And I'd just like to introduce our speaker today, who is Brad Schultz. He is a mechatronic engineer with over 25 years of experience working in technology and energy, carbon efficiency domains. He has spent the last 15 years working in energy management, building automation, optimisation with several building control companies. He now leads the service delivery team at Buildings Alive. Buildings Alive provide automated feedback and technical analysis to help optimize the energy and environmental performance of large, complex buildings. So I'm really excited to learn about this, being in the commercial sector. So, Brad, when you're ready, please take it away.
Thanks for the intro. And I should say I'm coming to you from the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal people up in Brisbane today. Yeah, so thanks for the intro. I know that you're keen to have discussions, so I'll try to keep this the overview fairly quick, and hopefully everyone likes graphs, because that's basically what most of the presentation is. So first one, I think everyone here is probably well aware of, so I don't need to really spend much time on. It's just how urgent and crazy things are getting in terms of climate change, and this is the daily sea surface temperature in the last anomaly, and we're basically off the chart now. So it's all extremely urgent what we're talking about in terms of transitioning to an emissions-free energy grid. And another one is that I assume people will be aware of as well is that and this is the Australian National Energy Market, so South Australia around to Queensland is decarbonising, which is great. And so we're not going fast enough or anything, but the interesting thing here is renewables are penetrating the grid to a significant extent. However, if you have a little bit of a closer look here, this is January this year. This is the average value of renewables on the grid. This is based on the spot price of energy and the wholesale market of energy that most buildings and consumers are not exposed to, but it's out there. You can see that renewables were getting $56 or $57 a megawatt hour, but fossil fuels were getting $120. So what's going on there, you might ask? Batteries are doing all right at the moment, but there's not many of them, increasing quickly though. I also assume people might be aware of what's known as the duct curve. This is very relevant to South Australia. This was originated in California, but essentially as solar energy penetrates the grid, we get this ramping situation in the evening where you've got a hot day, a lot of solar energy, sun goes down right when peak load's hitting. So it's a very challenging time for the electricity grid to handle, basically. Another piece of background here is that what you'll find is that at those times of a lot of solar generation on the grid, basically the real-time price of electricity on the wholesale market goes down very low. So we're looking at, and it goes negative. So, and this graph shows the increasing incidence of negative pricing on the Australian grid. So when from 10 years ago when it was happening almost never to greatly increasing over the last few years. You can see South Australia, as we're always using South Australia as an example of where the grid is going, basically, because you have such a fantastic, huge penetration of solar and wind. But what that does mean a lot of the time is that there's more than enough energy. Coal power stations you're connected to the other states. The coal power stations aren't ramping down or can't ramp down, so they have to sort of keep chugging along. And what's happening is that solar farms and wind farms are being turned off or curtailed to manage that and keep the grid stable at those times. And that's, that's a big problem for increasing penetration of renewable energy into the grid. The other interesting thing, I guess that I've been sort of alluded to, is that the pricing of electricity is proportional generally to the actual carbon intensity of that electricity. So we've got the carbon intensity of the grid. This is actually our South Australian plot here, and then the wholesale price. And you can see that there's zero. There's a lot of time here when the price is below zero, and generally that cheaper electricity is cleaner. So what that looks like when you look at it on a time series graph, you might know that buildings, when we're calculating a building's emissions for a year, at the moment, you basically say, okay, it's used 100 megawatt hours of electricity, or 100,000 kilowatt hours. You multiply that by a factor, kilograms per kilowatt hour, and then you work out the emissions impact of that building. But that might be nice and easy from an accounting perspective, but it's not actually accurate. This is New South Wales, so I just took a screenshot of this for last week. Basically, you can see that the dotted line is what the current official emissions factor is for the grid. You can see that it's spending a lot of time above that and sometime below it. That's in a week in late autumn. In summer, it might be a windy week and sunny week in summer. It might be spending all of its time below that line. South Australia is a little bit different because there's a lot more wind there generally, and so you can see that it's a similar, your average emissions are far lower, but there's still times when the actual carbon mix on the grid is very high. So we're not currently calculating our building impact, like environmental impact, correctly, because we're just using this average emissions factor. And along with that, what that means is that if buildings don't care about when they're using their energy, then they're not doing anything to either to capitalize on low price electricity and low carbon electricity, and also not doing anything to help stop things happening like solar farms turning off. So what that looks like from a building perspective is that the green line here is essentially we would normally think of as the energy profile for a particular building, and multiplied by the carbon emissions. That's the emissions profile of the building. But in reality, if you use the live carbon intensity of the grid, which is shown below that, what you actually get, and this is a typical commercial building, right? So it's an office building or something. So it's starting up in the morning, shutting down 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. However, the actual carbon profile of that building, you get a peak in the morning, it's low during the day, and then a peak in the evening. And that's just completely different to how most building operators, facility managers, engineers, contractors in the building, how they see the building's energy use at the moment. So I guess the question is, I'll jump to that one in a sec. What can we do about that? And what we've been doing for a long time at Buildings Alive, we provide feedback to buildings on their energy use. So basically on any given day, based on the weather conditions that the building is seeing, we can say, here's how the building should have operated yesterday based on the weather conditions. Are you on track? Are you off track? And what can we do to improve that? And part of that has been managing peak demand. So in this building's in Sydney, where peak demand charges, which have also gotten a little bit of media coverage recently because they're starting to appear on home users' bills, which is very difficult to explain what peak demand is to someone who knows nothing about energy. Basically, peak demand charge, you take the half-hour interval that your building's demand was highest for that month, or that, and in fact, for a lot of buildings, a lot of states, it applies for the whole year. So half an hour in January or February, you get this peak demand. That's what you're paying. That's essentially how big the pipe, the wires have to be to get the energy into the building. So you pay that charge all year. So what we do with our modeling is based on weather conditions and building performance, we'll alert buildings to when on a particular day they are at risk of breaching that peak demand limit. And then they'll operate the building slightly differently on those days by, and in this case, the peak demand charges kick in at 2 p.m. So for the first half of the day, we lowered temperature set points in the zones down to the bottom end of the scale. So normally on a hot summer's day, you might actually, you'd raise your temperature set points to the higher end of the scale. You might go 23.5, 24 degrees because it's hot outside. People are going to be comfortable at that temperature still. But what we do is essentially lower it early in the day, and then just before 2 p.m. when the peak demand charges kick in, just drop them back. And there's a lot of other strategies that can be done as well. So we drop them back and got a big drop in peak demand, and you can see that's really the equivalent of having, it's about 200 kilowatt hours for about 200 kilowatts, sorry, for about 4 hours. So that's like an 800 kilowatt hour battery essentially that it didn't need any manufacturing or heavy metals or anything. It's just sitting there in the building. So that can be done every day. And what we did, but basically, if you overlay that with the carbon intensity of the grid, then you can have, and instead of doing it just for peak demand charges, but do it every morning and every evening and automate it with the automated systems that buildings have. As we mentioned earlier, I'm a mechatronic engineer. My background in robotics, and buildings are essentially sophisticated robots with very sophisticated control systems. Large scale commercial buildings. They're often underutilized. They're just sort of turning things on and off and controlling to fix set points. But if you start to use those buildings to shift load around, you can really minimize the impact on the grid. And not only that, but actually get quite a huge economic benefit because you're going to avoid those times of higher price electricity. And that has been, we've been trying to get this out into the news recently. So we've done quite a lot of research on this, and you might have seen one or two of these articles over the last few weeks. Basically, rough calculations, like there's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that are being poured into the grid, both for generation and also transmission infrastructure over the next, however many years, especially leading up to 2030 when we have this 82% target. There's actually a massive opportunity for buildings, because if we can show that rather than building an expensive new transmission line, we can actually shift load in large amounts of building, that means there's even more. It's not just the price of electricity, but there's potentially a huge government economic incentive to do that, because that can avoid massive amounts of infrastructure cost. So I think what we said, our research was that if 33% of energy used in a building during the late afternoon in summer could be shifted to the middle of the day, that's something like 12 gigawatts of power that can be moved, and that's equivalent to like about 4 of the Eraring coal power stations, which you might have known in the news that the New South Wales government is paying Origin Energy up to potentially $450 million to keep this old coal power station going for an extra decade or more, basically, because they're worried about being able to provide a stable grid supply. And it's really just a waste of money, and there are other ways that could be better spent to achieve the same outcome. This is another building that did a peak demand shift overlaid with the actual grid carbon intensity of that day, and the demand shift was done essentially to save peak demand, but we had a look at the emissions impact, and it was about 16%. But the interesting thing was, we took that building and put it in South Australia on that particular day. It was windy in the morning, so it was low intensity electricity. Then it was the wind dropped off, so it was higher in the afternoon. And basically that resulted in a 68% greenhouse gas emissions savings in that building. So but there's no, with the current frameworks, there's no particular incentive for them to do that, but you can see what can be achieved. So I might leave it there for now. There's plenty of other topics that can be touched on here. The electrification of buildings and the impact that's having on, potentially having on electricity demand, but that's also an opportunity to integrate thermal storage in buildings, which can help with load shifting a lot. And then just the general opportunity for thermal storage as well, chilled water and hot water and ice and whatever. There's a lot of opportunities, because if you think about a chilled water storage tank is essentially just an insulated tank. It's got to be, if it's attractive to put a massively expensive battery on site, with a huge environmental impact of the manufacture of the battery, and they're great. Don't get me wrong, there's a very important, but surely the economics of an insulated water tank can stack up even better. We're not really seeing it at the moment. I'll leave it there for a sec and see what comments and questions we have.
Thanks, Brad. That was really interesting, and I think it was great for us to see the difference for South Australia, considering our grid, our green grid.
Those are a couple awesome charts. Can you, Brad, delve into sort of, I guess, in these charts, what were some of the things that they did to sort of move that peak demand earlier? And I guess one of my questions is, how much of the demand shift is a psychological and behavioral change versus just a technology and infrastructure change? Is it a bit of both, or is it more one than the other?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a few things. The control strategies are essentially set point adjustments. The first one. So just normally you might have there's a comfort range. Like a lot of buildings might operate at 22.5 degrees, but really you could go from 21 to 24, and that's within what should be an acceptable comfort range. So if you put it down to 21 degrees for a few hours to the point that the thermal mass of that building is taking on that temperature, when you drop it back to 24, that thermal inertia will carry it through for the rest of the day, like we've seen there. CO2 set points, normally they might be running at 800, 1000. You could also lower the CO2 set points for the first half of the day, so it's bringing in more fresh air, essentially charging the building with fresh air and actually making it more healthier even for the occupants. Then later on dropping that back to the normal set point, and you'll stop bringing in that outside air, and you'll have quite a lot of momentum there in terms of before the CO2 set point goes back up to a level that requires more fresh air. Plant lockouts or chilled water set points, making sure that's at the bottom of the range. And then when you're dropping it off, like you're locking out certain pieces of plant so that they don't drop back in. But to do all that, you do need a building that is well controlled, and you do hit initially when you start talking about this stuff. There's some buildings out there, a lot of buildings out there, like when talking about large complex buildings, that this does start to freak people out a bit, because they're like, oh, but we can't even keep everyone comfortable at the moment because we've got all these problems, in the building. So you really need good maintenance, a good collaboration between contractors, and that's often what we're doing with our clients day to day, is going in, looking at the energy performance, but then just helping go through a systematic tuning process to go, well, let's get the building under control so that you can control it properly, and then you can implement these things. And when you do implement these things, you take baby steps. You just try one thing, go, okay, I'm just going to adjust something by half a degree on a sort of a warm day, and just see what happens. And then you might go a degree, and then you try something else. And then as you collect those strategies, then you move to automation later on, where you can say, right now there's a button on the BMS, or it's connected to like an API where we will provide data to the building to say, right, operate the building today in peak demand mode, or if you're operating it to maximize carbon savings, here's the carbon profile forecast for today, and therefore that should tell you, when the building should use more energy and when it should use less energy.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for that insight, Brad. That's great.
It's actually pretty similar to what we just discussed, but more on a larger scale to make this happen. Do you think it's even realistic to expect not just new buildings, but smaller users to apply this? If we have to rely on user education, this is not going to happen. It needs to be automated, but if it's not a brand new building, it's not going to have this sophisticated BMS system and connection to the weather forecast that are required to make this possible.
So how hard would it be to retrofit into old buildings, or older buildings or smaller buildings, to have more benefits for a larger scale of people?
Yeah, I think this is one of those things that you need to start with the bigger, more complex buildings, prove it, and then you've got to really productize. There are quite a few, even at the home level, that you are starting to see products, IoT products that can respond to this. In fact, even your computers, like so Windows, has this thing. It's probably, I really don't know if it makes much difference, but you can check a box, or it might be checked by default, that says only apply, or preference applying the updates to Windows when the grid is cleaner in your area. So there, there's demand response programs, like in the US, there's a lot of grid driven programs around that. If your air conditioner has a internet connection, then it just sort of happens. You can opt in or opt out, and there'll be some level of control that applies. So I think with the prevalence of IoT devices, there's things that can be done. But yeah, educating domestic users, there's quite a few. Every few weeks at the moment, there's news reports about demand charges appearing on domestic users' bills, and it's just they're incensed because they don't understand what it is. It's an extra 40 or 50 bucks on their monthly energy bill, and it seems so unfair. It's like half an hour and I'm getting so. But having said that, anyone with solar panels on their roof gets it. Like, they're like, well, I'm getting nothing for this if it's going out to the grid. I want to maximize the use of my own energy. And that concept, I think people with solar panels get it. They're like, I'll put the washing on during the day. I'll wait till the sun's up rather than doing it at night. But the majority of people don't probably want to engage with this, so it does have to be automated. And there is a different processes at different industry segments for that.
Yeah, so let AI do the work.
So,
I had I was just wondering if you had kind of like done an analysis, or had found an average of cost benefits for an overall building, let's say during a year, if you're shifting your peak demand use, like how much cost savings could you achieve if you're automating your building and shifting your energy use?
So on the peak demand side, in a commercial building, peak demand charges typically might apply to, might be 30 or 40% of the bill. So it's very significant. And we regularly find that you can shave, if it's 40%, you can take 10% off of that. So that's essentially a 10% saving on the bill if you implement a robust peak demand strategy. So that's that's actually a huge saving. You'd have to do a lot of energy efficiency measures to get 10% in a large commercial building. When it comes to wholesale pricing, it's a little bit harder to quantify at the moment, because really there's no buildings really doing it at the moment, but there's a couple that are taking some baby steps, and we're finding that on the retail component of their bill, they can get 1 or 2 cents per kilowatt hour essentially off of what they're paying. Their load profile matches relatively well with lower priced wholesales, because there are some retailers around that not necessarily expose people to the wholesale price, because buildings don't really want to be is risk involved with that, and buildings don't want to be exposed to that risk. But there's some other mechanisms that they can use to just sort of look at, on average over the month, how well did your profile match with lower price electricity? And then we do have a practical example where they're receiving a 1 to 2 cent discount essentially because of their profile match. And that's before they've actually done a lot that's just because their profile naturally matches well with lower intensity, carbon intensity electricity. If they actually do more, they'll build on top of that 1 to 2 cent saving.
My question will be, obviously we're focusing on building by building. What happens, for example, where we have seen now state or private developments in nodes of the city, for example, whole neighborhoods? Can this be extrapolated to being used in whole neighborhoods, for example, that get together in a community alliance and they install those BMS in all buildings, or new buildings having a complete revamp and working, for example, let's say in South Australia, a new project Bowden 10 years ago, or now Cornu sites or things like that, or in Sydney when we have in the eastern suburbs new neighborhoods. Could this be not only buildings as batteries, but whole neighborhoods as batteries? And how that will work, and what's the ownership of those? How would that relate? Or do we have those instruments in Australia? And if not, who are we comparing against with? You get me?
Yeah, it in terms of scaling and into what to do in new developments, it's probably not an area I'm interested in. What thoughts other people have on that? I can share a couple of things that are sort of happening in terms of one of the big problems is like at the moment is like where are the incentives to do this? Okay, so at the moment there's not really any much incentive for a neighborhood to do that. However, there is an incentive on you're seeing like aged care retirement villages often being an embedded network where everyone's sort of buying a house in the retirement village, but that retirement village is essentially has one grid meter, and the operator of that embedded network is putting solar on all the roofs and putting a battery on site because they know that they can get a better deal and have a better retail contract and still make money by selling electricity if they set it up like that. So I'm seeing more and more of that. Also, I should have mentioned before as well, people are probably familiar with the neighbours rating system for commercial buildings, commercial office buildings, and a lot of other segments. That essentially uses an average emissions factor at the moment. We've been doing a bit of work with neighbours on some very early works to say, well, what if there was an alternative scheme or a parallel scheme or something that actually indicated how well a building's operating in terms of its real impact. So that is happening. There's also Green Star ratings actually have a grid resilience point, and there's going to be 3 points, I think, and there's potentially going to be a special an extra few points available based on if it's a grid interactive building. There is a if you look up the Green Building Council, there's a discussion paper that they released last year called From Net Zero to Zero. We wrote that with the Green Building Council to talk about basically, this is the thing, everyone's talking about net zero, but buildings should really be 0, 0, not net zero. And that is a discussion paper on grid interactive buildings and the types of things that need to happen.
We've just got a comment here. In hotels, we program the BMS to track outdoor temperature to shift, set out, check in and out. We also track occupancy in reserving systems and actual occupying unoccupied with PIR read switches in large conference spaces. Significant gains are achieved by increasing thermal energy before peak demand kick in. With electric heat pumps, we anticipate demand periods and increase storage tank temperature early in the morning. Increased capacity on storage tank is also an equivalent to batteries. Do you want to elaborate on that? Have you guys been doing something similar?
Yeah, actually, hotels is a really interesting space at the moment because of the net. We're doing quite a bit of work with hotels on the because Neighbours has the net zero and government operations strategy is now making government hotel bookings take into consideration the Neighbours rating. So at the moment they're just reporting it, but then hopefully later on it will move to requiring a particular Neighbours rating if you're a government worker booking a hotel. This is federal government. And I think with the electrification, I sort of touched on that earlier. There's the challenge. So electrification is great, but if it's just sort of you take a boiler out and swap in that amount of heat pumps, which obviously takes a lot more space, but you potentially risk, if you look at the peak gas use of a boiler, it's at the absolute peak, sort of dirtiest, most expensive time on the grid for electricity, often in the middle of winter. The sun hasn't come up yet. I know hotel profiles are sort of a bit different to commercial buildings as well, but there's still that similar thing. And I think the capex that's going into electrification is a great time to design in that thermal storage and maximize it as much as practical in the space constraints of an existing building, both because it's good design in terms of you can probably get away with a lower amount of heat pumps then because you've got a little bit of storage there, but also then it gives you that flexibility to capitalize on some of these things that will be coming down the track. I think because regardless of what we do, electrical tariffs are going to start reflecting this more and more. You know, you have the solar sponge tariff in Adelaide, which encourages use in the middle of the day that you can go on. There's going to be more of that where the tariffs are going to increasingly have to reflect what's actually happening on the grid, just to encourage, you know, that consumer behavior.
Yeah, I think Ken's just mentioned there's some residential retailers, IO Energy and People's Choice Circular Grid, which are incentivizing load shifts.
Wilson, did you want to? I know you came on camera, so thanks for joining in. But did you, because you left that comment, did you want to say anything to expand on what Brad also mentioned?
Yeah, we've had interesting chats about hotels. They particularly demanding. We can't really shift demand because people are paying to stay in a hotel. And if you've got a 5-star hotel, you can't just all of a sudden drop the set point to upset a guest that is paying quite a bit of money for a hotel, right? So it is very challenging. But I guess I could have written an essay about this. But when I refer to heat pumps, this particular example, we replaced a gas fire boiler, as Brad would have referred to. But the beauty of it is that this is a regional property, so we have access to renewable energy resources as well. So at the moment we're purchasing everything renewable, but then we've got potential to put PV in the car park, and so it has to be planned. It has to be future planned. And when it comes to controls, like shifting all these demand, the issue that we've got about 70 hotels in our company. And the issue that we had is that the BMS systems are not robust enough to be able to monitor the energy consumption in different circuits and areas of the building. So you really don't know where the segregation is when it comes to consumption. So I think where we are now is working on those BMS systems, so then we can focus on how can we improve the overall efficiency of the building. So all this is it's quite interesting, but there's a lot of work, particularly in old buildings. It's quite difficult.
Yeah, no, I agree that yeah, and the hotels particularly, I think haven't had the focus that like commercial office buildings have had in terms of energy, right? It's just a different the economics are different, the incentives have been different. You haven't had things like neighbors ratings, you know, pushing. So yeah, it's great that neighbors, you know, is getting involved there. I think there's still a bit of work to do, but yeah, I know I've talked to Wilson before about this challenge, but and this is a particular focus of ours this year. Actually, is focusing on hotels, and you're right, going in and starting with the BMS and getting that up to scratch is an absolute first requirement before you can do any of this stuff. But the I guess that CapEx thing is just really important too, because like we're finding that yeah, I feel like there's a bit of ignorance in terms of amongst sort of consultants and things around to what, you know, we're designing things for what electricity tariffs are today and gas tariffs or whatever. But if you look at what's happening over the next 10 years, just going, well, yeah, sure, storage might not stack up if you just look at the bills that you've got right now, but what's it going to look like in 5 or 10 years towards the end of life of that particular piece of plant? That's really important.
Brad, sorry, what are the chances? Obviously, we've had neighbors done in all our hotels, and we're a public listed company. So one of the issues that we have is that we get them assessed, but there's really not a lot we have to do, right? And what are your predictions in terms of neighbors pushing a little bit of compliance, like what they've done with office spaces? Because I believe that any advancement in technology or sustainability has to be pushed by some sort of regulatory framework. So you mentioned before that government guests. So we're aware of that. So now any government corporate client needs to assess hotels whether they got initiatives or not. So but we don't have to, right? So but at the moment where the Energy Star rating becomes regular, it is a regulatory requirement, then we have to do something. So, and it is very hard because hotels are highly inefficient. So what are your predictions in that world?
just shared a we just last week published a blog post on this actually that goes into some detail on what happened in the commercial office space. And basically, what hopefully will happen is that there's no regulation to say a commercial office building must be a particular star rating, but once government started saying, and this net zero and government operations strategy at the moment just says we're going to report the neighbours rating. So that's a starting point. And it also says, I think, that anyone booking a hotel should take that neighbours rating into consideration. But there's no requirement to do that. But in office buildings, they said, I might have started like at 3.5 stars or something. They just said any new leases that are going to be signed have to be 3.5 stars. So if they start saying, and this is the net zero strategy, I believe says this is the intent in the next few years, which is to say governments, federal government, people booking a hotel, it needs to be a minimum of X stars. So that will just provide, even though I think government bookings are like 5% of hotel bookings or something, but that's enough to be of interest, right? So yeah, I don't think it's going to be, I think that will happen over the next few years in the hotel space.
Yeah.
Have you had any similar kind of examples using apartment buildings?
I haven't personally been involved in sort of large scale residential, but I think there it's a combination of the IoT devices in homes and programs that might push those, but there are, I think, when they do share services, especially domestic hot water and things, and when they're embedded networks, I think you'll see that sort of that thermal storage and battery storage coming into play, and the embedded network operator then trying to capitalize on and doing it at that level while not having to impact the residents at all, because they're not really going to want to have to think about it.
I was just going to jump in and say, as we see more of this mandatory scope 3 reporting from large corporates, mid corporates, small corporates, it's going to be a lot more interest in the performance of hotel rooms in particular, but everything along that supply chain. So I think that'll be a big market driver.
I've often like the scope 3 is used to avoid like upgrading a boiler or something, or like electrifying. They're like, oh, but this is only 5 years old. What about all the embodied energy in the boiler? And I've just done the back of the envelope calcs on that. Boilers are basically stainless steel and recyclable, and really it's something like if you replace a boiler, that's the building I was looking at, it used, that energy was covered by about 3 months of gas use of that boiler. So it was sort of, on the scheme of things, wasn't massively impactful.
Have you got any upcoming things we should be looking out for?
We're just trying to, I think, like I said, the hotel focus, I think, is a big one actually. But we're hopefully there will be a Green Star innovation point released at some point this year that looks at the grid interactive building thing. So if when people, everyone would like extra Green Star points on buildings that are working there, and that's something that I think will be interesting. The neighbours thing is early days, and probably can't say much about it because it's really just investigation work at the moment. But all I would say is that neighbours are aware of this. It's a greenhouse emissions scheme that it's sort of become an energy scheme because it's assumes energy and greenhouse gas are equal. But I think there's recognition that there's needs to be some innovation there over the coming years. And otherwise we're just starting to one by one automate. Start to automate some of this stuff in the few buildings that do where it does make sense at the moment.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Brad. I've taken lots of notes. I hope everyone else has as well, and finished their teas. Thank you for my tea, Christina.
No worries. So thanks again, Brad. That was really informative, and I think just continuing the conversation with stakeholders that we're working with, potential clients, and obviously from an operational point of view, it's really important, and becoming carbon neutral, or government sectors becoming carbon neutral, is going to be something to keep an eye on.
feel free to reach out if you've got any questions about any of that. Yeah, always going to be.
Great. Thanks a lot.
So much, Brad.
See you, everyone.
Guys.
Take care.